We'll, on it.
Yeah, it's
It's on. Yeah.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We get to start on time today. Have you noticed it's a little quieter in here today? Because the temperature's perfect to where the air conditioner's not on, right? It's kind of interesting because it seems like when we're singing and the air conditioner is on, we're a little louder because we're fighting that sound a little bit. I tend to notice those things. Well, good morning. We're going to continue our class on 1st and 2nd Peter. We're staying on track on the outline that I had, which means we'll only be in 1st Peter for another 4 weeks after this, and then we'll move to 2nd Peter. We do accelerate a little bit towards the end because we're going to try to cover chapter 5 in one day. But we're going to be in chapter 3 today. And the way I've outlined the class, we're going to talk about relationships. And if you've been reading 1 Peter and pretty familiar with the text, you know when we talk about relationships in chapter 3, we're going to really talk about kind of 4 different things. One is some words that are directed specifically towards wives, but also to wives in terms of unbelieving husbands, and then a little bit towards husbands, and then just to relationships in general. So we're going to cover that, and then the last section that we're going to cover today is up into verse 12, is several quotes of the Psalms. So it's actually a pretty it's an important area, but it's going to move pretty quickly. And when you cover these verses, what tends to happen is you tend to bounce around a little bit to some other similar verses, like in Ephesians, or even Dan had one up here in 1 Corinthians, to talk about some of the similar topics. But what I want to do is maybe look at it slightly differently, because there's one area on this kind of EQ or emotional intelligence spectrum that we haven't touched on as much. And I think right here in the middle of 1 Peter is a good time to talk about this, because it's kind of an underlying way that we develop emotional intelligence, and that's motivation. What motivates us? And I think it's going to be particularly helpful when we go to something that's as very relative in the day-to-day as the topic that we'll get to when we get into chapter 3 here in just a minute. And I think what we're going to find is the underlying nature of motivation is tied to almost every theme in the book of 1 Peter. So let's define motivation in terms of emotional intelligence, and I think you'll see what I mean. A person with high emotional intelligence is motivated by intrinsic factors, so what's on the inside, allowing them to maintain a focus, to pursue goals with a sustained energy, to adapt to changes and circumstances, and ultimately leading to better performance and better satisfaction. So the idea of motivation is not foreign in our Bibles, although we don't use those words. Often, if you want to turn there real quick, we might go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 when we talk about, does motive matter? So in 1 Corinthians 13, obviously it's the chapter in love, and it starts, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of all prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith so as to move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. So there's this idea that permeates the scriptures that our motivations, our driving factors are important. But the interesting thing is that as we've looked at some of the driving factors, they're not all intrinsic. Some of them are external. And as we think about the difference between intellectual intelligence and emotional intelligence, we can see there's kind of a divide there, because intellectual intelligence is kind of this internal, and emotional intelligence is also internal, but it's kind of driven from kind of that emotional state rather than that mental state. So we've talked about rejoicing in trials in 1 Peter. We talked about this call for holiness, this call to be a royal priesthood, this call to honor authority and to suffering unjustly. Those are two topics that we talked about last week. And with all of them, there you can have this underpinning of what's my motivation to do those things. And in the first chapter, we see motivation in just the command of obedience to motivate, and sometimes fear was used as a motivator, so those are really external. Also an underlying motivation by reading the Word, becoming familiar with the Word, using the Word as a source, and so on. But there's really kind of two main things that can motivate us. It's something that I think we reflect a lot on in anything that we're trying to accomplish. What motivates us? And one of my favorite business authors is Patrick Lencioni, and he has written a lot of great books on kind of the behavior of people and relationships in the workplace. And they're very good. A lot of the business books, if you look at them, really are just taking principles of the way we treat one another as Christians and secularizing them, making them sound good, whether it's Dale Carnegie or some of these other ones. And Patrick Lencioni's material is no different. But his most recent book, and DJ Smith actually did one of his Monday motivating videos that he publishes on our website on this several months ago, and I was not aware of this book having come out, was questioning what's people's motives for getting into leadership in this case. And he said it was a book that he wished he'd written first, or could have written first, or should have written first. It's one of his shortest books, because it explains why, although people understood the philosophies in his business books, that they don't do them as leaders, because the motive was in the wrong place. And I think we can relate to that as Christians as well, because we do find ourselves at risk of only gaining intellectual intelligence on what we're studying and not embracing it emotionally and not having the right motives. And the two motives that he focuses on in this book are reward-centered motivation. This is for someone to get into leadership. So reward-centered motivation. So some people become leaders in businesses and organizations simply because they want the reward. Which, most of us will joke in business and industry that that's not a very good motivator, because in most of the circumstances, the cliche is, twice the work for 10% more pay. Right? It doesn't usually work out that well. Sometimes it does, I guess, if you get into higher level leadership. But the second one is this responsibility-centered motivation, where a leader is motivated specifically as an opportunity to serve others. So it's this idea of servant-style leadership. And his point in here is that there really is no other kind of leadership, really, because the first one is just what is in it for me, and the second one is this idea that I'm doing it for others. And he'll even use this analogy, which I really appreciated, that a CEO could be referred to as the chief suffering officer. And you can see how that relates to 1 Peter here, because that's kind of the theme of 1 Peter, is that to be called to be a leader, in his mind, you have to be willing to suffer. But the top one there on reward-centered leadership, again, is this idea of you can be motivated by what the reward is. And interestingly, we see that in 1 Peter, because Peter's going to emphasize to kind of hold on to the fact that we have salvation in Jesus through what he did on the cross. And we can also see that use of fear, not fearing what people can do to you, but fearing God because he's the ultimate authority. So we can see reward-centered motivation exists, it has its value, but the growth trajectory is to be the servant leader, which is ultimately going to lead to some of these more difficult things like suffering unjustly. And that's the call that we're called to. And Peter will often use in places within 1 Peter, I think either 3 or 4 places, he'll say, you've been called for this purpose, to suffer unjustly, to suffer like in the example of Christ. So last week when we talked about this idea of honoring authority and suffering unjustly, it was this idea of what we do in respect to our government. And it's a little abstract because we're, throughout most of human history, most human beings have lived under some form of feudalism where there was very few that ruled the many, very few that had much, and most had very little. Most were subject to authority that was very strong-handed throughout all of human history. That was certainly the case of the circumstances that they had here in the first century with the persecution that they were suffering. And we don't really have that today, not to the extent that they had, although we fear that's the trajectory sometimes of our country and of our government. We don't have that today. And then the second major topic, in the last section was this idea of what happens if you become a Christian and you find yourself a slave. How do you treat your master? Which we don't have that really in the world today in terms of being a state-sanctioned or law-sanctioned form of slavery, but we know there's all kinds of forms of slavery in this world that people are subject to. So it's a little distant, it's a little hard to relate to. But then we come to our text today, and Peter's going to talk to us about our relationships in the marriage relationship. So he's not going to just talk about marriage, he's also going to talk about just generally, he's going to sum it up. But he starts in the same way. So he's going to talk about wives, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of the wives as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. So in the same way, wives. Now, what's interesting here is Peter's going to spend 6 verses talking to wives and 1 verse talking to husbands. And we'll see why in just a minute when we get to it. But one of the circumstances the early Christians had, if you can imagine what's unique to the formative years of Christianity, many of us marry people that have the same faith that we do, right? That are already Christians. That's one of the kind of marks of what we look for in a spouse. In this period, most were new converts, so they wouldn't have converted necessarily at the same time. So many people found themselves in this situation, particularly the wives mentioned here, where they had an unbelieving spouse. And what were they to do? And the interesting thing is Peter says, in a similar way, that you have to submit to the government authorities and be respectful towards your master. If you're in the slave-master relationship, you need to have the same attitude when you approach your marriage. And again, there's lots of verses on this, but the similar way, I think, here is not so much that there's really any relation between being subject to the institution of the government. It's more that the path to make change is to kind of bear up under it a little bit. And that's the idea we have here, that they're to be won over without a word. And there's a practical reason for that I think we all understand and respect, and that is we understand from the biblical model of male spiritual leadership that if the wife is too forceful in a process of conversion, then that kind of sets a tone for not allowing that husband to have that responsibility of male spiritual leadership. There are circumstances we know where it's better if that training or that conversion sometimes happens through, and that study happens through other means. But it's really this beautiful idea that you can be effective in leading, in this case, a husband to the Lord, not by being overtly bold and kind of taking authority and taking the reins, but by having this observable behavior. And we all experience this too, I think, for those of us in the workplace. I've lived in the Northeast, and I've worked for companies in the Northeast. And let's just say the language and the decorum tends to be a little bit better in the South. And there's undoubtedly, over time, people will recognize that you don't participate in the same language, that you're not the same as everyone else. And so that has an effect. That opens doors for the gospel. And so in a much broader way, we see that in these verses here. And then it shifts too to kind of reinforce that with this idea of what they were to be wearing. And I think the point is not so much what they're wearing, but it's really what happens on the inside, which is a message, I think, to all Christians. So let's read this. Your adornment must be not merely external braiding of the hair or wearing gold or jewelry or putting on a dress, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. So, the true beauty of, the Christian life is not what's outward, it's cultivating what happens inwardly, and that is what has that leadership quality that will, have an effect on that unbelieving husband. We're to all of us as Christians are to not prioritize our physical appearance over our internal attributes. The next verse is where it gets even more interesting, and this kind of follows with what Peter has been doing throughout the book, and that is he'll bring up this principle and then he'll reference either through a quote or in this case just through an expression or an explanation something in the Old Testament. So he talks about how he's kind of setting this idea, for in this way in former times holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you have become her children if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear. So what's interesting here, Katie's talked to me in many ways, but she's never called me Lord. I hope that's the case in here as well. What's the point, though? What's the point? Respect. That's exactly right. So it's this idea that you can see in the biblical narrative this relationship of Sarah and Abraham, and that was a submissive state that showed respect. But what's really kind of this paradigm is this leadership that a wife can have in a marriage to an unbeliever kind of falls into that same category of that quiet and willingness to suffer. Now, I don't want to jump off into the tangents of, an abuse situation or some other situations, but simply kind of challenge us to think about how here we have this example of submissiveness to government, submissiveness to slaves and master situation, submissiveness to just Christ in general. And the way to handle those situations is sometimes we just have to absorb it because it's not going to produce the outcome by always reacting to it. And that's really a high mark for emotional intelligence is being able to restrain your emotions and not react and allow things to just kind of pass by. And there's this call specifically for wives to try to be that way. And I think there's going to be reciprocal here in just a minute for men and husbands and the way they do things as well. And it's kind of a beautiful, very direct message on what the Christian conduct should be in a marriage and what that relationship looks like. But it's kind of giving you the secret sauce, if you will. Because what happens when we do the opposite of this? Does it help or make things worse? And that's kind of the interesting thing about Peter's advice when they're suffering persecution. Peter, having come from a mindset at one time that I need to fight, and then, after the cross and after the Holy Spirit and the day of Pentecost, and Peter having a real understanding, he understood that sometimes I need to suffer for the sake of Christ to promote the cause of Christ because it's going to have this great effect. And now he's calling to wives saying, hey, in a similar way, you can have this effect in your marriage not by picking up the sword. Not by picking up the sword. And we're not going to be off the hook for this as husbands either, or anybody in any kind of personal relationship. So look at the husband's statement. Husbands in the same way. So what does that mean? We've gone from in a similar way to the previous chapter. This is one of the reasons why there's 6 verses on the wives and only 1 on the husbands, because you're kind of subject to the same idea. The language is a little bit different to the wife, using the word submit, but actually in reality, the emotional intelligence aspect of it, or the manner, is really prescribed universally. If we were to look at Ephesians, and if we have time, maybe we will, before it has very similar language to the wives in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 21, it says, be subject to one another. And then it breaks into this wives being subject to the husbands. The difference is not, as we're going to see here, because there's an unequalness or a lesser value, but simply because of these roles that are important. And interestingly, each, the husband and the wife, are all given these imperatives to be a certain way, probably because our predisposition might be to be the opposite. And I really think this is true in the husband-wife relationship because, my experience, Kay and I will be married 30 years this January, women often they live in the space of kind of emotional intelligence more than men do, and they also have more of a spiritual sense than men do. And yet, it's the men that are called to be the leaders. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. And vice versa here, we'll read this in just a minute, is that men have this tendency to be domineering, to be overbearing sometimes. There's references in some of the similar passages to how husbands or fathers actually exacerbate their children, for example. We can tend to be that way, and yet we're called to consider that and to think differently about it. So you husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker. Some versions say weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So if you look at the second half of the verse compared to the first half of the verse, you know that you're not saying a woman is weaker in value, but it is giving that analogy that, generally speaking, not in every case, the physical body of a woman is not as strong as a man. I know that's something that has created a lot of controversy in recent years in our society, and it's been subverted in ways that we could not even imagine 10 years ago. But we all experience that, those of us who are married, in most cases. If we're in a position where we need to grab something heavy and carry it, for example. And so there's this idea that Peter's saying, hey, understand that you're different, you have different roles, but that shouldn't change the way that, especially in the Christmas dispensation, that you honor her as a fellow heir, This is what would have been somewhat of a controversial mindset in the pagan world of that day. In some cases, women in some pagan cultures were very revered because of the mystery of childbirth. But in many cases, women and children were treated as second-class citizens, right? So in reality, in that time period, the idea that in Christianity, men and women were held as equal heirs would have been somewhat of a radical concept. But I think what's also interesting is this statement at the very end of this verse that's stated directly to husbands, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Isn't that interesting that there's this concept that, by me not having the right honor and respect to my wife, that can hinder my prayers. If you think through your life and your relationship with your spouse in times when maybe you were not working in this understanding way, or showing honor and respect, if you think about that, have you ever thought about, are my prayers hindered? I think it's a great question. Now, this is a very challenging verse, particularly from the husband's perspective, because we know from just popular psychology and just the reality of our lives that men understanding women is exceedingly difficult, and vice versa. It uses the word, understanding. But the understanding way here, I don't think is indicative of we really grasp, their perspective, because we're co-heirs. We come together as a helper and to work to have a Christian home. But understanding each other is exceedingly difficult. You can read all manners of books on that. Men are from, Mars, and women from Venus, or something like that. It's been a while since I've read that book. But then he's going to take this whole topic. These are the parallel passages. If we have time, we'll come back to them, and bring it to everybody. To sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit. So when we talk about relationships, whether it's a husband and wife or whether it's a relationship with each other, we have this call to allow what Christ did on the cross, allow what we read in God's Word, allow this idea of suffering, sometimes unjustly, to make us be really, really conscious of one another and what the other person wants. So it's kind of this idea that I started the class with of servant leadership, no matter who we're working with or who we're talking with, at all times. And, it's just a reinforcement of the Sermon on the Mount on just this idea of values that we're to have in Christian living. And what often is the opposite of that is the next verse, is we tend to have this repartee in our relationships, So he jumps directly into this, and it's tied directly to how we're treating one another, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead, for you were called for this very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing. So, in relationships, this concept of trickling down the idea of serving one another in our relationships, is that difficult? In the marriage relationship? You have to work at it. What about just in general in our relationships? Let's say on the spectrum, if you're in a work environment, are some people easier to get along with than others? Absolutely. So is there a different message to work with the difficult person than the easy person? No, but what does this passage tell us if we're dealing with a difficult person we should do?
We have to remember we don't take God's job away from him. He says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. We don't repay evil for evil or insult for insult or anything like that, because that's not our job. That's God's job to take care of as he pleases.
Yep, that's exactly right. We don't put ourselves in the place of God. Romans 13 talks about not returning evil for evil. But this is exceedingly hard. And what's interesting is, in the environment that the readers of the day were reading this, they would have had very, very challenging situations where they would be threatened by persecution, and the response is not to have this response back, this kind of antagonism that can happen. It is true in the marriage relationship, it is true with our coworkers and colleagues, it's true within our church family. Because what happens if there's the opposite? Has anybody here had a relationship where it's a relationship of just returning the same thing back and forth? What happens in that situation? Becomes like a stalemate, right? We've all, in our human experience, have developed people that we kind of conflict with. And what happens when one person backs down? When one person backs down in that situation? It opens the door? Yeah. So you have this ability to de-escalate a situation at almost any time. Peter's given us like the secret sauce. We can use this, especially in a marriage relationship, especially when we're dealing with Christians. But if you want to really diffuse the situation, let's say you're fighting with a brother or sister or a husband or a wife or whatever the situation is, and you say, well, let's pray together about it. Then all of a sudden it diffuses the situation. this is kind of a step in that process where sometimes, and we'll go back to this early verse, sorry, I'm not quite getting to it. Sometimes one of the most powerful things that we can do, and not just in a husband-wife situation, is just to be silent. That's harder for some of us than others, yes.
And my experience of it was that if somebody mistreated me, if I would shower them with more kindness than I had ever before, it changed everything. They actually became kinder and treated me much better than they ever had before. So showering people with kindness, and of course, if I'm a husband and I shower my wife.
So showering people with kindness often has that effect. I mentioned praying for stopping a situation that's escalating by mentioning God and praying about it, but generally speaking, we're also told to pray for our enemies. I think all of us could really take this to heart. I have the advantage of only being 3 weeks into a job and starting over, but do we have the habit, if there's someone that we have a conflict with, that they're on our prayer list? I mean, I think that's a great habit to have, and it's a great piece of advice of how we deal with that. So it goes a little further here about not just returning evil for evil, because Peter does what he has been doing. He goes back to an Old Testament passage. In this case, I think it's Psalms 34. He's going to quote several verses out of Psalms 34. And they're very simplistic, and it's going to lead into what we're going to talk about over the next 3 weeks. But this is a quote from Psalm 34. For the one who desires life and to love and to see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. So there's this idea of peacekeeping, this idea of holding your tongue, this idea of being truthful. And then this next verse, for the eyes of the Lord are towards the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. I think this is also ties back to our relationship to the government, and Peter will constantly make these references to you can either suffer for having done something evil, or you can suffer for having doing the right thing. And this is, again, against kind of our culture, because in our culture, we glorify people getting back, people getting revenge. All you have to do is turn on the TV or turn on a movie or see whatever book is popular. It's about getting back against your enemies, and this teaches us something completely different. So I do have another slide of this, because I want to kind of tease the next couple classes, but this is kind of my traditional end of class slide. And the first question is, how do I feel about my motives? What really drives my motivation? And I think, again, that's not in all these questions when I'm asking how I feel, how you feel is not to be a measure of direction. It's more to be a measure of where I'm at on my journey. And in our walks with the Lord and us trying to follow his example, our motives might start from something that's not a very good motive. It might be fear. It might be just simple obedience. I remember when I was young, we had chores, and one of them was to do the dishes. And I was late, and my dad asked me to do the dishes, and I started just practically throwing the dishes into the dishwasher, like almost in anger. And my dad stopped me, and he said, if you're going to do it like that, I'd rather you not do it at all. It goes right back to that 1 Corinthians 13, this idea that even if you're obedient, even if you have all these gifts and all these abilities, if the right motive isn't there, then it has very little value. So, challenging ideas. To the wives, how do you feel about submitting? To the husbands, how do you feel about your prayers being hindered? That's something to think about. Can you think back in your life and think, have I ever hindered my prayers by having an inappropriate or not following this pattern that's given to us? And then to all of us, how do we feel about being sympathetic and brotherly and kind-hearted and humble? One of the early books of Patrick Lencioni that I kind of use when I'm trying to hire people, he has this idea of the perfect team player, I think is the book, that you want your employees to be hungry, humble, and smart. And not everyone has all of those attributes. But I think that kind of gives kind of this idea of not just having the intellectual scent of understanding what God's Word says, but also being able to kind of grow to where how we're motivated about it is out of a spirit of humility. So I said I was going to tease the next couple of weeks. We're going to get back into suffering, and we're going to think a little harder about some real life examples of how that affects us in our daily life, and some challenging verses. But somebody that I recently read a book that was really a really good book. Jordan Peterson wrote a book, 12 Rules for Life. But he's kind of like a C.S. Lewis of the day in a sense that he's somebody who really wrestles with humanity and Christianity. And he made a couple of statements I think go very much along the lines with Peter, because he makes these statements that life is suffering. That it's clear that there's no more basic, irrefutable truth. It's basically what God tells Adam and Eve immediately after they eat the apple. You're going to have to work hard, and you're going to suffer, and you're going to die. And it's very plain speak of what we kind of understand in the biblical narrative. And then he has this other comment: the purpose of life is to find the largest burden that you can bear and bear it. And there's some real principles in what we're going to talk about in the next couple of weeks, because we've already tiptoed into it, that there's two types of sufferings laid out in Peter. One is just simply suffering for breaking the law, for law breaking. That's what the government is there, is to punish that. So we understand that and we accept it. What we tend not to accept is this other type of suffering where we're suffering unjustly, when we're suffering because we don't deserve it. And yet Peter's going to bring that together and say, look, you're called to do that. When you say, I'm going to follow Christ, I'm called to kind of have this mission that Jordan Peterson mentioned: the purpose of life is finding the largest burden you can bear and bear it. Challenging statement, not quite direct from the Bible, but the principle is there. So in the next 3 weeks, we're really going to dig deep into this. And why is it that we're called to suffer, and what's the effect? Because in this verse, or these verses, we learned the effect of a wife having an unbelieving husband, and how that husband is won through her behavior and her spirit. In this case, I'll give away the end before we even get into it. How do we reach the world with Christianity? How do we spread the gospel? It's this willingness to suffer like Christ suffered, to follow his example, to follow in his steps. And that verse that I mentioned last week, which I think in some ways is the theme of the chapter, is what we're going to get to next week. It's verse 15 of chapter 3. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is within you, yet with gentleness and reverence. We're called to suffer sometimes because we have to take a stand when the opportunity arises. And we have to be ready, leaning on the Word, to say something, to do something. And that will lead to suffering. That's kind of what Peter's saying here, is that by living a life of holiness, people will notice, and circumstances will happen. Well, you'll have an opportunity to defend your faith. And don't think that that's going to make your life easier. It's not. That's why you're called to suffer as a Christian. So it's going to get really challenging and interesting over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Any comments or questions before we conclude? Yes. Yeah. We'll have to talk about that next time. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Says Adam was created first.
Correct.
And Eve was deceived first. So the Bible gives us a reason for that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wasn't just arbitrary. There was a reason it was done.
Yeah, the Bible does give us a reason for male spiritual leadership. It goes back to the very beginning in the garden. And like I said, often when we go over these verses, we spend a lot of time laying that out, to be sensitive to that. But I thought it was even more interesting to be sensitive to this idea that the way that we treat one another is all about following Christ. So the Ephesians passage, Ephesians chapter 5, has this idea of Christ as the head of the church. And then it breaks down into the leadership of the family. But everyone's pointing back to Christ. Yep.
This all boils down to our heart.
Yep.
Our outward appearance reflects our heart.
Yep.
The way we act, the way we dress, the things we do, our outward appearance reflects our heart.
That's 100%. Well, our outward appearance affects our heart. And EQ, again, it was this concept that came up in the 90s. It's becoming more popular for people to talk about it. But that's really all it is. It's how do you change your heart? And we talked about it early on. IQ is something you're kind of born with, but EQ is where you can grow. And we see that in Peter, and we see these challenges that he gives us in 1 Peter. And I think it's very easy to teach to the intellect, but it's really hard to teach the heart. It's really hard to teach the heart. So, all right, we're at time. Thank you all. Have a great day. Enjoy the beautiful weather.